Before I call the Prime Minister, I am sure the House will wish to reflect for a moment on the fact that this is a solemn day which marks the first anniversary of the terrorist attack on Israel, with dozens of hostages still in captivity. The conflict has claimed thousands of innocent civilian lives. Today is a day when we should come together to remember those, all of those who have been affected. I now call the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today we mark a year since the horrific attack on Israel by the terrorists of Hamas. It was the bloodiest day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust. A day of sorrow, a day of grief. Over 1,000 people were massacred, hundreds taken hostage, in an attack born of hatred, targeted not just at individuals, but at Jewish communities, at their way of life, and at the State of Israel, the symbol of Jewish security to the world. Mr. Speaker, 15 British citizens were brutally slain that day. Another has since died in captivity. Our thoughts today are with the Jewish people around the world, the Jewish community here in the United Kingdom, and all those that we lost a year ago. For so many, the pain and horror of that day is as acute today as it was a year ago. They live it every day. Last week, I met the families of British hostages and those killed on the 7th of October. I sat with them as they told me about their loved ones. I will never forget their words. Mandy Damari spoke of her love for her daughter Emily. She said, and I quote, "My personal clock stopped at 10:24 on the 7th of October, the moment when Emily sent a desperate, unfinished message as Hamas attacked her kibbutz. She is still held captive today." We can hardly imagine what hostages like Emily are going through, nor what the families are going through. The agony, day after day. So I say again, the hostages must be returned immediately and unconditionally. They will always be uppermost in our minds. And I pay tribute again to the families for their incredible dignity and determination. Mr. Speaker, today is also a day of grief for the wider region as we look back on a year of conflict and suffering. The human toll amongst innocent civilians in Gaza is truly devastating. Over 41,000 Palestinians have been killed, tens of thousands orphaned, almost 2 million displaced, facing disease, starvation, desperation, without proper health care or shelter. It is a living nightmare, and it must end. We stand with all innocent victims in Israel, Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, and beyond. And we stand with all communities here in the United Kingdom against hatred of Jews or Muslims. Because any attack on a minority is an attack on our proud values of tolerance and respect, and we will not stand for it. Mr. Speaker, with the Middle East close to the brink and the very real danger of a regional war, last week the Iranian regime chose to strike Israel. The whole House will join me in utterly condemning this attack. We support Israel's right to defend herself against Iran's aggression, in line with international law. Because let's be very clear, this was not a defensive action by Iran. It was an act of aggression and a major escalation in response to the death of a terrorist leader. It exposes once again Iran's malign role in the region. They helped equip Hamas for the 7th of October attacks. They armed Hezbollah. who launched a year-long barrage of rockets on northern Israel, forcing 60,000 Israelis to flee their homes. And they support the Houthis, who mount direct attacks on Israel and continue to attack international shipping. Mr. Speaker, the whole House, I know, will join me in thanking our brave servicemen and servicewomen who have shown their usual courage in countering this threat. But make no mistake, the region cannot endure another year of this. Civilians on all sides have suffered too much. All sides must now step back from the brink and find the courage of restraint. There is no military solution to these challenges, so we must renew our diplomatic efforts. And together with my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, I've had discussions with the leaders of Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, the Palestinian Authority, the G7 and the EU, and made the case at the United Nations for political solutions to end the fighting. In the weeks ahead, we will continue this work, focused on three areas. Firstly, Lebanon, where our immediate priority is the safety of British citizens. Our team is on the ground, helping to get people out. We've already brought over 430 people home on chartered flights, and we stand ready with additional evacuation efforts as necessary. And I say again, an important message to British citizens still in Lebanon: you must leave now. Mr. Speaker, we're also working to ease the humanitarian crisis in Lebanon. Last week, we provided £10 million of vital support, in addition to the £5 million we're already providing to UNICEF. But the situation cannot go on. We will continue to lead calls for an immediate ceasefire and the return to a political plan for Lebanon, based on Security Council Resolution 1701, which requires Hezbollah to withdraw north of the Litani River. They must stop firing rockets and end this now, so that people on both sides of the border can return to their homes. Second, Mr. Speaker, we must renew efforts for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. But we cannot simply wait for this to happen. We must do more now to provide relief to the civilian population. And that's why we've restarted aid to UNRWA. We're supporting field hospitals and the delivery of water, healthcare and treatment for malnourished children. But the ongoing restrictions on aid are impossible to justify. Israel must open more crossings and allow life-saving aid to flow. Crucially, they must provide a safe haven for aid workers. Too many have been killed, including 3 British citizens. Israel must act now, so that together with our allies, we can surge humanitarian support ahead of the winter. Third, Mr. Speaker, we must put in place solutions for the long term to break the relentless cycle of violence. The ultimate goal here is well understood. It must be the two-state solution. There is no other option which offers stability and security. So we need to build a political route towards it, so that Israel is finally safe and secure, alongside the long-promised Palestinian state. This requires support for the Palestinian Authority to step into the vacuum in Gaza. It requires an urgent international effort to support reconstruction, and it requires guarantees for Israel's security. We will work with our allies and partners to that end. But the key to all this remains a ceasefire in Gaza now. The unconditional release of the hostages, the unhindered flow of aid. That is the fundamental first step to change the trajectory of the region. Mr. Speaker, nobody in this House can truly imagine what it feels like to cower under the bodies of your friends, hoping a terrorist won't find you, mere minutes after dancing at a music festival. Nobody in this House can truly imagine seeing your city, your homes, your schools, your hospitals, your businesses obliterated, with your neighbours and family buried underneath. It is beyond our comprehension. And with that should come a humility. It is hard even to understand the full depth of this pain. But what we can do is remember. What we can do is respect and listen to the voices that reach out to us at these moments. And what we can do, Mr. Speaker, is use the power of diplomacy to try and find practical steps that minimise the suffering on the ground and work towards that long-term solution, so that a year of this terrible and bloody conflict can never happen again. That is what we've done on these benches. That is what the whole House has done. And it's what this government will continue to do. I commend this statement to the House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Leader of the Opposition, Rishi Sunak.
Can I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement? Today is the anniversary of October the 7th. This modern pogrom, the worst loss of life, Jewish life, since the Second World War, was a horrendous reminder of the anti-Semitism in our world and the existential threats that Israel faces. Over the last year, many of the hostages kidnapped by Hamas on the 7th of October have been raped, sexually abused, murdered, and mutilated beyond recognition. And today, a year on, many still remain held by Hamas and other terrorist groups. I think particularly today of the British citizen Emily Damari, who has endured a year in captivity. Across this House, I know that we join in saying, bring them home. The situation in the Middle East is grave. Too many innocent civilian lives have been lost. It is right that this country continues to play its part in defending Israel against Iranian attacks. But we should not forget the base cause of all these events: Iran's refusal to accept Israel's right to exist, and its desire to destabilise the region through arming and funding its terrorist proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. The current conflict in Lebanon is a result of Hezbollah's determination to use this territory to launch rocket attacks on Israel. And let me be clear, Israel has a right to defend itself. It has a right to eliminate the leadership of Hezbollah, and it has a right to restore security for its citizens. And this country should support Israel in pursuing these goals. But can the Prime Minister tell the House and expound on what he said about what role the United Kingdom is playing in providing humanitarian support to those Lebanese citizens who have been displaced because of this conflict? And I welcome, I think, his announcements on some financial support to that end. The medium-term question we must help address is what happens once the Israeli operation has finished. And can I ask the Prime Minister to update the House on what steps this country, along with our allies, are taking to help build up the capacity of the Lebanese state so that Hezbollah cannot simply re-establish itself in southern Lebanon? We must never forget that Hezbollah do not represent the interests of Lebanon or its citizens, but those of their paymasters in Tehran. Turning to the situation of British nationals in Lebanon, I know that the government has rightly been urging them to leave for some time now, but it is clear that difficulties in obtaining tickets on commercial flights mean a number of our citizens are still there. I welcome the government's chartering of planes to help British nationals return home, and know very well the logistical challenges involved in this, and pay tribute to all the Foreign Office and other teams that will be working hard to make sure that this happens. And can the Prime Minister assure the House that any British national who wishes to leave Lebanon will be able to do so on a government-chartered flight? And turning next to the Prime Minister's speech at the UN General Assembly, which he mentioned, can I fully endorse his reaffirmation that the United Kingdom will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes? Events in the Middle East and indeed Ukraine are another reminder that the world is increasingly becoming more dangerous. If we wish to be able to continue to deter our enemies, defend our values and stand up for our interests, then we will need to invest more in our military. Now, the Prime Minister and I have discussed previously my view that we should increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2030. But in our previous exchanges and in this House, he said a trajectory for future defence spending would be set out at the coming fiscal event. And could I just ask that he reconfirm his commitment to that timetable? And finally, on this sad anniversary, can I finish by saying that the United Kingdom stands with Israel against this terrorism today, tomorrow, and always. And to the Jewish community here in Britain, I know that at moments like this, when the Jewish people are under attack in their homeland, Jewish people everywhere can feel less safe. And I know that the Prime Minister will agree with me that across this House, we will always stand against the evils of anti-Semitism.
Minister.
I thank the Leader of the Opposition for his words, and I do think it's important on an occasion like this that we speak as with one voice across the House, and I think the whole House will agree with him when he says, in relation to the hostages, we must bring them home. They must be uppermost in our minds. He asks about the assistance in Lebanon. Humanitarian assistance is being provided, aid and money, also training, as he will know, and working towards the Security Council resolution. In relation to the evacuations, he asked about British nationals, and we will make sure that any British national does have the assistance they need to come home. And again, I repeat, now is the time to leave, and if any British national requires that assistance, please make contact with us so that we can provide that assistance. In relation to the 2.5% of defence spending, let me recommit to that we will increase it to 2.5%, and we'll set out our plans in due course. But the most important thing today, I think, is for this House to do it as it is doing, which is speak with one voice on the one-year anniversary of an awful terrorist attack. Thank you.
Chair of the Select Committee, Emily Thornberry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. On this anniversary, the House unites in its condemnation of the murder of over 1,000 Israeli citizens and makes a united call for the release of 100 hostages. Parliament also stands behind a belief in the rules-based international order, a belief that all civilian life is equal and must be protected. And so today we mark a year when more than 41,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, 742 people have been killed in the West Bank, and over 2,000 people have been killed in Lebanon. Will the Prime Minister confirm that all British actions in the Middle East will be guided by the principles of de-escalation, peace and diplomacy, and the protection of all civilian life?
I thank her for that question, and particularly her words about all civilian life being equal and protected. And I do confirm that everything we're doing is aimed at de-escalating across the region. It is on the brink, and I think it is important for all sides to pull back from the brink. And that's why we've been working so closely with our allies in the G7 on de-escalation, speaking with one voice. Thank you.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Davey.
Can I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement? On the anniversary of those horrific attacks in Israel, we remember the victims, the people taken hostage and their families, and we stand with the whole Jewish community. Earlier this year I visited Israel and Palestine and saw how both peoples were experiencing trauma. We must never forget the trauma of the hostages and their families. In Tel Aviv, I met Itzik Horn, a father still praying for his two sons, Yair and Eitan, to come home. So we must urge all actors to take the steps most likely to get the hostages home quickly and safely. The last year has seen terrible violence in the Middle East, a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, and an appalling spike in hate crimes here in the UK. So, we must stand firm against anti-Semitism, Islamophobia. We must press for an immediate bilateral ceasefire to end the terrible cycle of violence and bring about lasting peace and security for both Israelis and Palestinians. And we must do all we can to prevent a regional war in the Middle East. UK forces rightly played their part in helping Israel neutralise Iran's outrageous attacks. Now I hope the government will try to convince Israel that keeping her citizens safe and secure is best achieved by restraint, not retaliation, and the risk of a regional war. And as we do, let us take a tougher stance on Iran and all her proxies, from Hezbollah to the Houthis. So will the Prime Minister finally prescribe Iran's revolutionary guard? And finally, Mr. Speaker, we are horrified by the new crisis unfolding in Lebanon. So first, will the government go further on humanitarian aid? And most importantly, can we join the Prime Minister in calling for the cessation of rocket fire, the protection of civilians, and an immediate bilateral ceasefire, just like the one we so desperately need in Gaza?
I thank him for those questions and absolutely agree with him in relation to the hostage families. When I sat with them, often we were sitting in silence because they couldn't find the words to describe what they were going through, and what he says about hate crimes. In relation, and the message and the messaging is very much de-escalation across the region. In relation to the IRGC, look, we do need to deal with state threats, including the IRGC. He's right about that. We're working at pace to identify further ways to deal with those threats, including those from the IRGC. Already more than 400 sanctioned designations against Iranian organisations and individuals are in place, and we continue to look at that important issue. Thank you.
Florence Eshalomi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate myself with the words and remarks from the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition in condemning this horrific attack a year ago? Yesterday at church during bidding prayers, we prayed for the conflict around the Middle East and the other conflicts going on. And my thoughts remain with those loved ones who are still displaced a year on. Mr. Speaker, sadly, the United Nations have reported credible evidence of sexual violence against innocent civilians on both sides of this conflict. No matter the intensity of the situation, there can be no justification for sexual violence, which leaves those victims traumatised for many years. So can I ask the Prime Minister what steps the government are taking to raise this issue and to ensure that innocent civilians across the Middle East are protected from the horrors of sexual violence?
Prime Minister.
She raises a very important point about sexual violence, which, as she rightly says, has absolutely no justification, and along with other issues, it's an issue we continue to raise with our allies in relation to any such allegations.
For the House, Sir Edward Leigh.
There are many different opinions on policy in the Middle East, but will the Prime Minister agree with me that what unites us, or surely must unite everyone in this House, is our profound detestation of anti-Semitism in all its shapes and forces, and our profound love for the Jewish people on a day of suffering, especially as many of those murdered in the music festival and in the kibbutz were actually actively working for peace? And will he reflect that there are still many people, many Jewish and Arab people, who do want a moderate solution, and we should give them their support?
Prime Minister.
Can I agree wholeheartedly with the remarks in relation to anti-Semitism and a love for and standing with Jewish people, as I say, both across the globe and here in the United Kingdom, many of whom want nothing more than peace and security for themselves and their families, and we will continue to work with them. But I agree with his remarks and the sentiment behind them.
Clive Betts.
Could I agree very much with my right honourable friend's comments about the need for a two-state solution and working towards that on all sides? Does he understand my concern, then, I think wider concern, that the Israeli Prime Minister has repeatedly said in recent weeks that he doesn't support a two-state solution either now or in the future? Does he understand the frustration and anger that creates amongst many Palestinians, particularly young Palestinians, and breeds a climate in where hostilities and violence is likely to increase rather than reduce? What can he do to change the Israeli Prime Minister's mind?
Prime Minister.
We have to be very clear that the two-state solution is the only viable long-term route through this conflict. And recognition has to be a question of when, not if. Israel has a right to be safe and secure, and it's not, and we must have a viable Palestinian state. And however difficult that may seem at the moment, we must never lose sight that that in the end is the only political solution to this awful conflict. Thank you.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A year on from when 1,200 Jewish people were systematically murdered, those that were women were raped and mutilated. 254 were taken hostage into Gaza. 101 still remain unaccounted for. I agree with the Prime Minister that we need to make sure that the hostages are returned immediately. But the first aspect of this is to ensure that the International Red Cross have access to all those hostages to assess their state of health and indeed whether they are still alive. Will he press for that to make sure that we know how many are still alive and they can be returned to their families? Those that have sadly been murdered, at least their families will know what has happened to them.
Prime Minister.
Yes, and it's very important. Spending any time with the families, you get a real sense of the agony in what they're going through, which is made even worse by the fact that they don't have any meaningful information about their loved ones. So that is an absolutely essential step to at least reduce some of the agony. I agree with him.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We in my constituency of Walthamstow stand today with our neighbour Sharon in saying the name of her father, Oded Lifshitz, who has been held by Hamas for over a year now, a proud peace activist. We stand with our Palestinian neighbours who were able to escape from Gaza and who now fear for their relatives and what harm may befall them. We stand with our neighbour trying to get out of Lebanon, where he was trying to support local children to learn. We reject the lazy stereotype in this conflict that you have to pick a side. We pick peace. And we simply ask of the Prime Minister to do and show the same. So what reassurance can my honourable friend give me and my constituents in Walthamstow today that everything that the British have in fighting for the rule of law, for diplomacy, and yes, even in our work on arms sales, will be dedicated towards peace and resolution for the innocent civilians in these regions?
Prime Minister.
I thank her for her question. It's a reminder of the impact here in the United Kingdom of the conflict on so many of our communities, and we are absolutely working with our allies on de-escalating across the region. It does require Iran to take responsibility and to be held accountable for what it is doing, and that's why it's important, in my view, for the G7 to speak so powerfully together with a coordinated and collaborative approach.
Layla Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today is a devastating day, a sobering day. For those who are suffering the pain of grief, it feels that the claws are being run over those wounds again. We have seen escalation now in the region, something that this House was warning about for months before this point. It is clearer now than ever that the Palestinian question, when the embers finally die down and we can start to rebuild, must be the #1 priority on his and other world leaders' lists, not because it's the right thing to do, but because it is a security concern that we must address if we want a safer world. So will the Prime Minister agree with me that we need to be now showing unprecedented levels of leadership? And may I ask him, what is he doing personally to add to that?
I thank her for her question. She speaks powerfully as ever on this issue. I completely agree that the only way through in the long term is the two-state solution. And in direct answer to her question, we are working non-stop with our allies on that question, answering what happens next, and never losing sight of the fact that the two-state solution is the only way to that long-lasting peace. And we will continue in those efforts. And I know that they have the support of the House. It's so important that we continue to do so, and we will continue to do so. Thank you.
Andy Slaughter.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister rightly says we need a ceasefire now, but after a year and over 45,000 deaths, what more can he do to achieve that ceasefire? And while the violence in the region continues, will he ask the Foreign Secretary and Home Secretary to look sympathetically at requests from dependents and close relatives of UK citizens for evacuation?
Prime Minister.
On the question of a ceasefire, in answer to his question, we are continuing to work with allies to bring that ceasefire about, to coordinate our efforts. And I recognise that diplomacy is sometimes slow, but it is in the end the only way to bring about that ceasefire. We'll continue to do so. In relation to British citizens in Lebanon, we do have a plan in place. If anybody across the House has any details of our citizens who need further assistance, I would genuinely be pleased if they'd pass them to me so we can action that straight away.
Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the anniversary of that terrorist attack last year, may I echo the sentiments of the Prime Minister in condemning Hamas support for our Jewish community and, of course, in calling for the release of all the hostages. I also share the Prime Minister's concern about the malign influence of Iran. In that regard, can he confirm to the House that there will be no British involvement, be that personnel, facilities or air bases, in any Israeli response to their abhorrent attack last week?
Prime Minister.
I thank him for his question. I'm not, and he will understand, go into details on the floor of the House as to our capabilities, but he will know that the involvement so far, for example, in relation to the attack in April, was in relation to Israel's self-defence when missiles were raining in on Israel, and that is the support that we did provide and would always be prepared to provide.
Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, as we remember all those killed in the 7th of October Hamas attack and all those killed day after day in Israel's war on Gaza and now Lebanon, the case for peace and the preservation of human life and the protection of human life has never been more urgent and compelling. An immediate ceasefire is desperately needed to stop all the killing, end the war crimes, free the hostages and get the aid into Gaza. But it's clear Israel's right-wing political leaders will keep rejecting ceasefires and keep violating international law without stronger international pressure. So, to get Israeli leaders to back a ceasefire, don't we need to see tougher action, including an end to all arms sales, as recent international court rulings demand?
Prime Minister.
Look, I completely agree that we need an immediate ceasefire, and that is what we're working with. It's what the US in particular is leading on. I don't agree with a complete ban on arms sales. That, Mr. Speaker, would include a ban on arms being used for defensive purposes. Looking at the attack of only a few days ago by Iran, I think the House will understand my position on this and the position of many across the House.
Dame Priti Patel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has rightly spoken about the significance of diplomacy right now, and I think this entire House would agree that across the region itself, leaders must come together. So can I ask the Prime Minister, what discussions has he had with GCC leaders, the leadership across the GCC, about the behaviour, the aggressive behaviour of their neighbour, Iran, and what role they can play in the de-escalation and preventing Iran from further escalating this terrible conflict?
Prime Minister.
I thank you for that question. This is a really important issue. We have had numerous discussions with our colleagues and with leaders, and I do think there's an important role that can be played and pressure that can be put through those discussions, and we will continue to do so. So I thank her for her question.
Dr. Rupa Huck.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Among those killed in the horrors of October the 7th were children, with a number still held hostage to this day. And in Gaza since, a grisly new acronym, WCNSF, Wounded Child, No Surviving Family, to add to the child death toll, which is now 2 mounting in Lebanon. Would my right honourable friend press for the protection of children as a priority in his ceasefire advocating and humanitarian efforts? And would he agree that no parent should ever be burying their child?
Prime Minister.
Well, I absolutely agree with that. And whether it's children taken as hostages, it hardly seems possible to say that sentence without recoiling. or those orphaned in Gaza, she rightly suggests. Thank you.
Julian Lewis.
I appreciate that it's difficult to get into the mind of a theocratic regime such as the Ayatollahs in Iran, but to what extent has the government been able to establish whether a principal motivation for what happened on October the 7th was the desire of the Iranian regime to prevent a rapprochement between Israel and Saudi Arabia, its great rival?
Prime Minister.
Look, Iran bears huge responsibility across the region, both in their assistance in relation to the October the 7th attack and through the other action that they are supporting in the region. And that is why we've been very clear in our positioning on Iran and very clear about the responsibility that Iran bears in relation to these awful incidents.
Zara Sultan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the anniversary of the horrific October the 7th attacks, I again repeat the call for the immediate release of all hostages. And in light of Israel's genocidal assault in Gaza, the violence in the West Bank and the invasion of Lebanon, I asked the Prime Minister if he believes that Israel's right to self-defence justifies a death toll, according to research by US medical professionals who have worked in Gaza, has now surpassed 118,000, as well as the 2,000 people killed in Lebanon. And will he do what is morally and legally right and end the government's complicity in war crimes by banning all arms sales to Israel, including F-35 fighter jets, not just 30 licences, yes or no?
Minister.
No. But it is a really serious point. Banning all sales would mean none for defensive purposes.
F-35 fighter jets.
None for defensive purposes on the anniversary of October the 7th, and days after a huge attack by Iran into Israel would be the wrong position for this government, and I will not take it.
Sammy Wilson.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has rightly pointed out that the conflict in the Middle East has been manipulated and sponsored by the Iranian regime, and we should stand by Israel, who is bearing the burden, taking the risks and standing up to world opinion in taking on Iran and its proxy terrorist groups. But can he tell us what part can our government play in putting pressure on the Iranian regime, and why is it that the Revolutionary Guards, who are sponsoring much of this terrorism, can still operate freely in London?
Prime Minister.
Can I agree with him? We must stand by Israel and be absolutely clear about Israel's right to defend herself, particularly at this time of escalation by Iran. I think in relation to his question about the Iranian regime, we have to be really clear that we stand with Israel. We have to be really clear in condemning Iran, and we have to do that with our allies with one voice, so that the message is heard very, very powerfully. Thank you.
Clive Ethan.
Speaker, I associate myself with the condemnation of the atrocities committed by Hamas a year ago. But that said, there is a growing humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and the restriction on aid is unacceptable. So what more can the international community do to achieve the free movement of aid into Gaza?
Prime Minister.
I addressed this in my statement. We need to get more humanitarian aid in. It's desperately needed. It's been needed for a very, very long time. And that is why we continue to press for that aid to go in, and of course for the protection to go in for those that will then be delivering it once the aid gets in to Gaza that is desperately needed.
Robert Jenrick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since the barbaric attack on October the 7th, we've seen an explosion in anti-Semitism and extremism on our streets of our own country. Only on Saturday, we saw people flagrantly valorising Hezbollah in London. We have to root out those who despise our country and our values. What will the Prime Minister do to revoke visas, where appropriate, of those in the UK who are conducting themselves in this manner, to encourage the police to enforce our existing laws without fear or favour, and to further ban and prescribe those organisations such as the IRGC, which do not support the UK, our values, and the way we wish to conduct ourselves in the world.
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for his question, and we are proud of the democratic right to protest in this country, but supporting a prescribed terrorist group is unacceptable, and we need to be very, very clear about that and give the police our full support in taking the action that they need to take in relation to it, wherever it is in the United Kingdom.
Manjeet Singh Desi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As we mark the anniversary of the horrific Hamas attacks, the subsequent colossal death and destruction, and the ensuing escalation in the region, for anybody in any doubt in the country, Iran is no friend of ours, and indeed is disliked by many of its neighbouring Arab nations for its destabilising activities in the region. And it was abundantly clear to many of us that as soon as Iran came to the aid of its proxy Hezbollah, that Israel's allies would come to its aid to protect it from Iranian missiles. However, it is also extremely frustrating that Prime Minister Netanyahu continues to ignore the international community, the UN Security Council resolutions, indeed our own UK Prime Minister, who was one of the first to call for an immediate ceasefire between Lebanon and Israel, and indeed this UK Parliament, which voted 8 months ago for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. So, Prime Minister, how exactly is the UK government going to help bring all sides to the negotiating table and secure peace?
Prime Minister.
Well, his comments about Iran are absolutely right, and we must stand with Israel in the face of the attacks wherever they come from, wherever they are sponsored. And in direct answer to his question, we are working with our allies on de-escalation. We are working with the US in particular on their plan for a ceasefire, because it is only through a ceasefire that we can create the space for the hostages to be safely released, for the aid to get into the region, and a foot in the door for the political solution, a two-state solution, which is the only way to lasting peace.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister spoke quite rightly of the fact that we can barely imagine the pain of both the Israeli families and those in Gaza affected over the past year since that Hamas atrocity. But it's also a pain that's felt acutely in our own communities, by our Jewish communities and our Muslim communities. So can the Prime Minister tell us, since we've had 5,000, a record number of anti-Semitic attacks in this country since that atrocity, what he's going to do to reassure the Jewish and Muslim communities and work with the CST and Tel Mama to strengthen their bonds?
Prime Minister.
She raises a really important point, and we have upped the support to both communities as a result of the dreadful rise in hate crime in all its manifestations in the last year or so, and we will continue to do so, and I know we'll have the support of the House in doing so.
Alex Sobel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today's day of mourning for all those who lost family members on October the 7th and in hostage in tunnels since, for all those civilians in Gaza, the West Bank and now in Lebanon. Like the Prime Minister, I've been meeting hostage families all this last year. The only time they got released was when there was a hostage prisoner deal on the 22nd November last year, where 150 prisoners were released and 50 hostages released. Has the Prime Minister spoken to the Israeli government about another deal to allow the hostages to be released through swapping with political prisoners held in Israeli jails?
Prime Minister.
I accept his point that it's through a cessation of hostilities that the space can be created for the release of hostages. And yes, of course, we talk to leaders, including in Israel, the whole time about how that can be brought about, because it is the central focus of all of our discussions with Israel and with our allies.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's vitally important that on today and every day we remember every single life lost at the hands of Hamas a year ago, every single life who was lost in captivity since, and renew our calls for the release of every single hostage. And whilst I totally agree with the Prime Minister when he says that Israel must have that right to defend herself, Some of the decisions he has taken has led to a feeling that this government has stepped back its support for Israel, not least in the restoration of the funding of UNRWA. Does the Prime Minister regret that, and will he revisit that decision so that actions marry up with words?
Prime Minister.
No, there's been no stepping back of support for Israel. We've been absolutely robust in that support, and I've expressed it many, many times in different places, including to the Prime Minister of Israel, and we will continue to support Israel. We'll continue to support Israel's right to defend herself. I think this House is at its best when it speaks with one voice.
Mohammed Yazid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's been a year of profound suffering, darkness and trauma. Tens of thousands of innocent people have been killed and displaced. Yet the world has learned nothing. The prospect of two-state solution is a distant dream, and the odds of all-out war in the Middle East is growing by the day. The unimaginable devastation has to stop. The only hope is a diplomatic solution. So can the Prime Minister show me today that the government is doing everything in its power to bring about an immediate and permanent ceasefire across the region?
Yes, and we are not doing it alone. We're working with our allies in relation to it. I spoke to G7 allies last week about it. We speak constantly to the US about it because we need to de-escalate across the region. We've seen escalation in recent days and weeks, and all sides need to pull back from the brink.
Ali Chan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of the Green Party, I'd like to associate myself with the remarks made by the Prime Minister and others in this House today in remembrance of all those who lost their lives and were taken hostage in the horrific terrorist acts on October 7th last year. One of those was Haim Katzman, murdered by Hamas in Kibbutz Hoyle, and whose brother Noy has had his words included in a collection of speeches and eulogies published today by Standing Together. Noy says this of Haim: "I have no doubt that, even in the face of Hamas's people that murdered him, in the face of their extreme right-wing beliefs, he would still call out against killing and violence of innocent people. Here, too, he would be empathetic to pain and oppression." These are powerful words, and in this spirit, I'd like to express my continued and deep concern at the disproportionate response of Israel to the attacks on October the 7th and the extent to which that has perpetuated pain, oppression, and the killing of innocent people. In recent days, this response has resulted in an escalation of deadly violence. I welcome the Prime Minister's words today about commitment to de-escalation. Does he agree that an urgent ceasefire both between Israel and Hezbollah and between Israel in Gaza is essential to resolve the conflict?
Well, she read out some very powerful words, which I think will have been heard across the House. And yes, de-escalation is absolutely needed at the moment as the region stands on the brink.
Patricia Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and may I associate myself with your own words and those of the Prime Minister in opening his statement today. In any time of conflict, our focus must be on two things: de-escalation and peace, and on the plight of the civilian population, whether they be those hostages kidnapped on the 7th of October, whether they be those in Lebanon now sheltering in the street, or whether they be those in Gaza who seek to find health facilities to treat their loved ones and themselves when they suffer from attacks by Israel. What more can we do to support the health service in Lebanon, which is now on its knees and which really does need our support if it is to help the people of Lebanon?
We do need to help and assist with the health services in Lebanon, and along with the other humanitarian support that we're putting in, along with the support we're putting in relation to training and other matters. It's so important that we do so, and we are in constant contact with the Lebanese authorities in relation to that.
Dr. Andrew Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of us have been fortunate enough to see the very good work that UNRWA has done on the ground over many years. But to be effective, an aid delivery vehicle does need to be rigorously impartial. Given that, will the government treat with UNRWA with caution and carefully, and remember that other aid delivery agencies are available?
Prime Minister.
Look, of course we have to be careful and make sure that any agency absolutely complies with law, international law, and whether any allegations they're properly investigated and any wrongdoing is rooted out. We do have to provide or help to provide aid across the region, but it is caveated by the first part of my statement in relation to the point that he rightly raises.
Andy MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to put on record my sorrow at the appallingly violent events of the 7th of October 1 year ago in southern Israel, and for all the days of violence we've witnessed since. Mr. Speaker, since the House last met, the forced displacement of almost 2 million residents of Gaza by Israel's military action has been compounded by a further 500,000 forcibly displaced in Lebanon, again by Israeli military action. So can I ask the Prime Minister, does he share the concerns of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, that the Israeli invasion in destroying civilian infrastructure, killing civilians and impacting humanitarian operations is a breach of international law, and what further steps will he take to enforce a ceasefire?
Prime Minister.
Well, I'm not going to accept invitations to agree with other people's assessments. I'll make my own. I've been absolutely clear that Israel has the right to defend herself in accordance with international law. The displacement is a very serious issue across the region. Very many people have been displaced. Many of them simply want to go home. That includes Israelis as well, who've been displaced from their homes. And that is why we need to de-escalate, to ensure that those displaced can return back and live safely in their own communities.
Pritchard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In just 15 months, Iran will be free of many of its restrictions in its production of centrifuges and uranium enrichment under the JCPOA. Given the new nexus of evil of North Korea, Iran and Russia on nuclear technology transfer, does the Prime Minister believe the JCPOA is still fit for purpose?
Prime Minister.
He raises a really important point in relation to the nuclear ambitions that we absolutely have to be alive to and make sure that Iran cannot possibly get weapons, and the sanctions and the regime around that has to be geared towards that central issue.
Debbie Abrahams.
My heartfelt sympathies to the families who lost loved ones in the terror attack a year ago today, as well as those who have loved ones that are held in captivity at the moment. And I would also like to do the same for ordinary Palestinian civilians who have lost loved ones in the violence of the last year. It's quite clear that in today's heightened tension across the region, an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, in the West Bank, in the Lebanon is not possible. So will the Prime Minister share with us, he's talked about a roadmap, will he share with us what the steps are towards this peace process and the immediate ceasefire that is desperately needed in the region?
I accept that an immediate ceasefire is difficult. I do not accept that it's impossible. And the US and Qatar are working hard on this and have our full support in the action that they are taking, because the reason the US are leading on this is because they well understand the importance of a ceasefire to create the space for all of the other relief that needs to be provided, and of course for the hostages to be released.
Daisy Cooper.
This House knows that when events unfold abroad, they often reverberate on our streets here at home. Despite the trauma of the last 12 months, I'm incredibly proud that in St Albans, the rabbis, our imams and other religious leaders have worked hand in glove to make a bold statement called 5 Principles for Dialogue, Why Jews and Muslims Refuse to Hate Each Other. And they've taken that statement into our primary schools, into our secondary schools and into community forums as well. It's had a very profound effect in my community. Can I ask the Prime Minister, is the relevant government department actively seeking out examples of initiatives like this in order to build, or when necessary rebuild, interfaith dialogue and community cohesion right across the United Kingdom?
Prime Minister.
Yes, because I think it's really important, that joint work and some of the interfaith work that was done before October the 7th didn't have the resilience that many of us thought and hoped it would have. Rebuilding it is hard, but should be supported wherever it takes place. And I was interested to hear the particular example that she referred to.
Up to Sam Mohammed.
I thank the Prime Minister for his comments. My thoughts and prayers are with all of those affected by the violence and war over the past year. Human rights and international law apply equally and without favour. All lives matter, Palestinian, Israeli and Lebanese. When breaches of international law are committed, then they should be condemned equally. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that a ceasefire in Gaza is the best way to de-escalate violence? And will he give assurances that this government will do all it can to support diplomatic measures, keep an open review on arms sales? And does he agree that we must at all costs avoid getting involved in a Middle Eastern war which could have catastrophic consequences both here and abroad?
Prime Minister.
We are working constantly with our allies to de-escalate the situation, to hold those responsible to account and to ensure that we bring about the much sought-after peace that all communities want.
Sir John Whittingdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As well as the terrible loss of life of Israeli, Palestinian and Lebanese citizens, a shocking number of journalists have been killed or wounded while covering events in the Middle East. Will he pay tribute to the courage of journalists who are risking their lives daily simply to do their job? And will he re-emphasise the importance of protecting and respecting all media workers who are covering conflict?
Prime Minister.
Yes and yes. It's a very important point. Journalists, those working in the media, are risking their lives in order to ensure that the rest of us have information about what's going on the ground. Too many have lost their lives, and we must respect that and pay tribute to the really important work that they do. And I am grateful to him for raising a really important issue.
John MacDonald.
Today is a day of sombre remembrance of the suffering on all sides. But if the threat of a war against Iran takes place, we will need to revisit that discussion within this chamber. But I'm pleased that the Prime Minister has rightfully demonstrated that our concern about the suffering on all sides, and particularly mentioned the suffering of children. As the Ukraine war took place, we set up the scheme for the evacuation of children who are seriously injured in Ukraine to come here for treatment. In January, I raised the prospect of that scheme being introduced for Palestinian children and others. Raised it again in May. Wrote to my honourable friend and the Home Secretary and the Foreign Secretary in July. I wrote again in August and I wrote again in September. There doesn't seem to be any progress on developing such a scheme, despite the willingness of clinicians here. Could the Prime Minister look at that and how we can achieve progress?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for that, and he's right to emphasise the impact this has on children in particular, and we do have special responsibilities in relation to children in any conflict. The first step to protecting children is to create the conditions for a ceasefire, is to de-escalate, which is why, working with our allies, we are spending so much time on that de-escalation and finding a route through to a ceasefire.
Altos.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In February this year, I stood in the wreckage of some of the kibbutzim where the atrocities took place on the 7th of October, and I was struck then by the families who we met and their desire for peace rather than revenge. And since then, I'm afraid to say that I've heard minister after minister stand at the dispatch box and mouth the words of peace and de-escalation, and yet the situation has got worse and worse and worse. So my question to the Prime Minister is this: how many more people will have to die before we realise that talking is not enough and that we have to take action with our partners to compel a ceasefire?
Prime Minister.
I think what happens at the dispatch box is the reporting back of the action that we're taking elsewhere. That's under this government and under the last government. And when not at the dispatch box, we are working with our allies to bring about the ceasefire. I accept it's difficult. I accept it has not yet happened. I refuse to give up on the idea that through diplomacy we can reach that de-escalation and ceasefire, and we will continue to work with our allies to do so. I think what we've tried to do, particularly in recent weeks, is to coordinate with our allies so that we speak and take action in one coordinated way, which for me is more powerful than each nation taking action separately.
Tracy Gilbert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate myself with the words of honourable and right honourable members today and add my thoughts to the families and hostages that were taken a year ago, and I too hope for their safe return. Mr. Speaker, latest figures suggest there are approximately 6,000 Lebanese nationals in the UK with a temporary right to remain. Lebanese nationals in Edinburgh have recounted to me their fears about returning home and their concerns about the inevitable humanitarian crisis that will follow should the conflict continue. Can I ask my right honourable friend if the government will commit to looking at options to ensure no Lebanese national currently in the UK is forced to return to Lebanon during this current conflict?
Prime Minister.
Yes, I can give that assurance, and it's very important. We need to get British nationals who are in Lebanon out of Lebanon as quickly and as safely as possible, and we certainly shouldn't be returning people back to the conflict zone whilst the conflict is going on.
Ben Leigh.
Both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary delivered important statements at the UN last month, emphasising the importance of upholding both the principles and the purposes of the UN Charter as a foundation for rules-based international order. The PM rightly states today that a political settlement is the only route to a lasting peace and stability in the region. In working towards that aim, what consideration is his government giving to official recognition of Palestinian statehood?
Prime Minister.
The question of recognition is a question of when, not if. Well, at the point of greatest impact, we do need a two-state solution. We need to work with our allies towards that end, and we will continue to do so because this conflict will not de-escalate until there's a political route through.
Apsana Begum.
It is with profound sadness that we take stock of the past year, in which 1,200 Israelis were killed by Hamas's horrific attack, and over 41,000 Palestinians and thousands in Lebanon that have been killed by the Israeli military onslaught. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that all lives should be cherished, Israeli, Palestinian and Lebanese, and that nothing can ever justify the deliberate targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure, and will he join me in calling for a ceasefire and accountability in the region of the Middle East?
Prime Minister.
I certainly agree that all lives should be cherished, and I think that is the position across the House. As I've said, de-escalation and a ceasefire is the only way forward, which is why we're working so hard on it.
Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While I welcome the Prime Minister's call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, there is so much more he can do to bring that about. As South Africa's Foreign Minister said, the decision to stop the fighting in Gaza is in the hands of those who supply Israel with weapons. And he knows that international law does not differentiate between offensive weapons and defensive weapons. So why does he continue to licence 90% of weapons sales to Israel when there is ample proof that UK weapons are still being used to prolong this catastrophe?
Prime Minister.
For the reason I've twice stated, if sale of weapons for defensive use by Israel were banned, that is a position that I could not countenance a year after October the 7th. It's not a position I could countenance in the face of attacks by Iran. The whole House saw the number of missiles coming over into Israel only the other day. And the idea that we could say we support Israel's right to defend herself and at the same time deprive her of the means to do so is so wholly inconsistent that it will never be my position.
Chris Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The scale of the devastation that we have seen in the Middle East is appalling, including, in recent weeks, 127 innocent children killed in Lebanon. The scale of death is appalling, and the potential for further escalation is terrifying. Can the Prime Minister tell the House how he is working with his fellow world leaders to push for de-escalation and a peaceful settlement?
Prime Minister.
Yes, we are working with our colleagues and our allies constantly, whether that's through the G7, whether that's on bilaterally, a numerous daily contact on this to bring about the de-escalation that is so desperately needed.
John Lamont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hezbollah began its latest assault on Israel on 8th of October, the day after Hamas's attacks on Israel. The Iran-backed terror group has fired over 12,000 rockets towards Israel over the past year, yet the international community only called for a ceasefire after Israel responded. Now, the Prime Minister said he's committed to standing by Israel against the threats it faces, but will he deliver on his commitment to prescribe Iran's IRGC?
Prime Minister.
Well, in relation to the IRGC, I gave an answer earlier on in relation to that. We do need to address state threats, and we're looking at how we can do that, and we'll continue to do so.
Linda Ward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Prime Minister has said, the horrific Hamas attacks 1 year ago inflicted unbearable pain and loss on Israeli civilians, and we continue to condemn these attacks in the strongest terms. I remember clearly too the fear that my then colleagues in Gaza, Palestinian aid workers, felt as bombs began dropping on them that night. The healthcare system in Gaza is now all but destroyed, and according to the UN, there have been 36 recent attacks on healthcare facilities in Lebanon. Israeli forces are also now using fighter jets to bomb refugee camps in the West Bank. Does the Prime Minister agree that this is unacceptable? And as he will be aware, the UK Government is the UN Security Council lead on the protection of civilians. Next month, when the UK has the UN Security Council presidency, will he ensure a focus on the protection of civilians?
Prime Minister.
Well, she speaks with great experience, and yes, we need aid into the region, and we need to protect aid workers, because that is the only way that the aid can get where it is needed.
Leigh Shelbrooke. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And today we mark that terrible anniversary of the biggest slaughter of Jews since the Second World War. And we must also note that since that day, over 60,000 Israelis have been displaced in northern Israel by the actions of Hezbollah. Therefore, the Israeli government had no choice but to mobilise the IDF, and any Israeli citizen has to do that. Yesterday in Leeds, I'm very proud that the city had a multi-faith remembrance service in Millennium Square, over 1,000 people. And does the Prime Minister agree that that's in marked contrast to the individual who drove out into hiding the Jewish chaplain of Leeds because he had to serve as a member of the IDF because he's an Israeli citizen? Is that not a pure act of hatred and anti-Semitism? Prime Minister.
We must hunt that hatred out wherever we see it, and he's quite right to raise it and to call it out. We must also focus on the multi-faith work, and he referenced that, and I think across the House we want to see more of it. And he's absolutely right about the displacement in northern Israel. Many families simply wanting to return to their homes, both sides of the border, but we must never forget the impact it has on them.
Nigel Kelliscan.
Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Prime Minister for his statement at what is a sombering day as we reflect on the past year, the atrocities of the 7th of October, and of course the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and now in Lebanon. In my constituency of Barking, I have communities that have links to Israel, to Gaza, to Palestine and also to Lebanon, and they regularly raise with me the need for an immediate ceasefire. Does the Prime Minister recognise that ceasefire is a critical step in what in the end can be the only solution, which is a political solution for the region?
Yes, and that's why we're working with allies, including the US, on seeking to bring it about.
Richard Holborn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. 1,200 butchered, 250 plus hostages taken, over 100 of whom are still there, including Emily Damari, a 28-year-old British citizen. Can the Prime Minister recommit today to do whatever it takes to leave no stone unturned in ensuring that she is returned to her family and that, if necessary, British assets are used to help extract her?
Prime Minister.
Yes, absolutely, and that is the commitment I gave to her mother and the other families that I met last week and then on various other occasions before that. I've sat with her mother and seen firsthand the utter agony that she is going through, as any parent would in those circumstances, and I gave her that commitment. I repeat it here.
Alex Burrell-Curtis.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. May I thank the Prime Minister for his statement and associate myself with the clear calls for unimpeded access to aid, immediate ceasefire and an immediate return of the hostages. But since this heinous terrorist attack 1 year ago, we have seen here at home a consequential increase in the crimes of hate, anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred. I know his commitment to tackling the scourge of such hatred. I've seen it up close. So will he assure me that his government will continue to challenge all such forms of hatred, both here and abroad?
Prime Minister.
Yes, absolutely. We can and we must. And I think across the House, we all know the impact of hate crime. We've all been horrified by the increase over the last 12 months, and we have a duty and a responsibility to do everything we can to reduce it, and we will work with others to do so.
Ayub Khan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I also join the Prime Minister in offering my condolences to the families of all those killed and continue to be killed? I also join the Prime Minister in relation to release of hostages, and all hostages, including those children that are held in the Israeli detention centres without charge and without any legal representation. Given what the Prime Minister said in relation to self-defence, when it's in itself is a moot point, is this Prime Minister stating to this House that all offensive weapons are banned and it's just defensive weapons that are being supplied?
He will well know the legal framework that we have, the domestic legislation in place that was passed and applied by successive governments and our international obligations. We've taken our decisions against that legislation in accordance with that legislation, as the House would expect. And we have published a summary of our reasons for doing so for the House to examine.
Johnny Ward.
You don't know.
Condolences to all those affected by the terrorist attacks on the 7th of October. And can I also thank the Prime Minister for his statement today? Can I ask the Prime Minister if he agrees with me that the sharp rise in anti-Semitism that we've seen since the 7th of October, actually now reaching the highest ever recorded in the UK, is a stain on our democracy? And can I ask him to pass his reassurances to the Jewish communities across the UK that his government's doing everything it can to ensure their security and safety and to tackle this scourge of anti-Semitism?
Let me give that reassurance. I think we are all shocked by the sharp rise in anti-Semitism. We need to work with all communities to bring that down in relation to hate crime, whichever community it is aimed at, whether it's the Jewish community, Muslim community or any other community.
Joy Morris.
May I thank the Prime Minister for clarifying the government's position on Israel's right to defend itself? And will the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary clarify to this House what steps are being taken to tackle violent disorder and anti-Semitism in London? Many people in many British Jewish communities here in London feel under threat. Particularly this weekend, we saw violent protests. What is the government going to do to tackle that and to make our British Jewish communities feel safe again?
We have to support the right to freedom of protest, but at the same time be absolutely clear in relation to terrorist organisations and support for terrorist organisations that is not to be tolerated, and we will work with the police and other law enforcement to ensure that we tackle it and stand very, very firm on it.
Just silence.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, as with so many times in the history of the Jewish people, we are bound in grief and in mourning. Would the Prime Minister assure the Jewish community that we are not alone in that grief? And would he take this opportunity to join me in praising the dignity, the courage and the love shown by the families and friends of the hostages in their efforts to bring them home?
Let me give that assurance that they're not alone, and let me pay tribute again to the families. It is incredibly moving to spend any time with them and to hear firsthand what they are going through. And as I've said to them every time I've met them, the impact it has, I think, on anybody listening to it, the impact it has on me is profound.
Iqbal Mohammed Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I join the Prime Minister and the House in offering my condolences to the families of all those Israeli civilians killed on October the 7th and all innocent civilians, Israeli, Palestinian, Lebanese or other, over the last 12 months. Over the last 12 months, over 950 Palestinian bloodlines have been wiped off the face of the earth. No family member remains from those generations. Over 1,000 families have only one sole survivor remaining, living today. What message does the Prime Minister have for the British Palestinians and the surviving Palestinians in the affected region, and what is he doing to protect them from the same fate as the 42,000 and counting?
There's been far too much bloodshed and killing, far too many children orphaned, and I give my assurance that we will do everything we can, and we are doing everything we can, to de-escalate, to bring about the ceasefire, to allow much-needed aid to go in, hostages to come out. But I absolutely understand the strength of the point that he puts to me.
Andrew George.
The Prime Minister says that I stand with Israel, I stand with peace, I stand with the Israeli people, and I stand with the Palestinians and the Lebanese equally. But this isn't mere semantics. I applaud that the military from the UK were involved in it, protecting Israelis at the weekend. But where is the equivalence for the people of Gaza and of Beirut and elsewhere?
In the work that we're doing to bring about de-escalation and a ceasefire, because that is the only route through. That is why we're working with our allies so closely on those issues, and we'll continue to do so.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The tragedy of the deaths a year ago have now been compounded by tens of thousands more deaths in Gaza, the West Bank and in Lebanon. Gaza is now reduced to a place of rubble and famine and thirst and premature death, and lots of children looking for their families. The bombs that have rained down on Gaza and other places are in part supplied by this country. The International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court have both made very strong opinions on the whole situation there. Will the Prime Minister revisit the whole situation of the sale of British arms that are being used to bomb Gaza and kill wholly innocent Palestinian civilians?
We've set out our position that domestic law is clear, international law is clear, and we've taken our decision and put a summary of that before the House.
Jim Allister.
Mr. Speaker, if those of us in this House at this distance can feel the pain of the dastardly attack of a year ago, we can but imagine the indelible imprint on the people of Israel and Jewish folk across the world. Can I ask the Prime Minister, has he a view on the fact that our national broadcaster, the BBC, refuses to call those who perfected this heinous terrorist attack, refuses to call them terrorists, and likewise now with Hezbollah? What is the government's position on that, and what representations have they made?
The government's position is that Hamas and Hezbollah are terrorist organisations. We stand very firm on that and rightly call them what they are.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to join the Prime Minister in condemning the Iranian ballistic missile attack last Tuesday, and I am supportive of the role that UK armed forces had in defeating that attack on Israel. Back in January, the Prime Minister said that parliamentary approval of military action is only needed when deploying troops. We don't know how Israel will respond to the Iranian attack, and the government could find that they are asked to contribute at short notice. Can the Prime Minister set out what he meant when he said that a parliamentary debate and vote would be taken only when deploying troops?
The whole House condemns the attack by Iran of a few days ago. We all saw the impact of that, and I think the whole House will understand that there will be occasions when it's important for a government to act without coming to this House first.
Tim Farrell.
Mr. Speaker, I too had the sobering experience that others have had of meeting some of the hostage families recently. One of those families, a member of one of those families, his brother had seen his wife, the mother of their new baby, murdered before his eyes just before he was taken by Hamas. And yet, the hostage families that I met showed a desire for peace and reconciliation, which I found utterly breathtaking and humbling, and it gives me hope. So does the Prime Minister agree that the release then of the hostages is not just the right thing in of itself? Of course it is, but it is also a major key to ending this conflict, because any ceasefire without the hostages release is de facto not a ceasefire.
Well, I do agree with that, and that's why I say the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages is what we must continue to press for. I too have been struck by the incredible resilience of the families. It's humbling to listen to them and comprehend what they're going through, but nonetheless their insistence that there has to be a peaceful way forward for all concerned.
Jim Sherman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank very much the Prime Minister for his statement today and for his strong statement, which we in this House support, and well done, thank you. In light of recent events, it's become clear that Israel's right to defend itself is supported verbally, but effectively condemned when Israel does take action. So would the Prime Minister, ever mindful of the 1,200 Israeli citizens so brutally murdered 1 year ago, today condemn the disgraceful anti-Semitic demonstrations that took place in the streets of London yesterday, and ensure that all military aid is made available for Israel against the murderous intentions of Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis and Iran? Thank you.
Let me condemn the anti-Semitism wherever it is, whenever it is. We must stamp it out and stand together across this House in doing so. Thank you.
That completes the statement. We will now let the front benches clear.